aging system.
Okay, they do a different aging system, right? Okay, so what are we talking about today?
Offensive speech.
Yes, which was offensive, me saying that you're from Thailand when I don't know where you're from.
I didn't find it as offensive, but some people might.
Yeah, we probably didn't find it as offensive because you already told me you were from there. So anyway, offensive speech, right? Offensive speech is a hot topic right now because everybody seems so easily offended, particularly your generation.
Yes.
Right? Because my generation, you could punch us in the face and we're not offended. You could call us names, right? You could spit at me, and I'm just glad I've got somebody's attention, right?
Yeah.
We're never offended in my generation.
And you have the guy talk thing, it's normal.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. To offend each other, right?
Yeah.
That was part of my generation, but not your generation, right?
It's toxic now.
It's toxic, right? So here's the thing, though. People need to think carefully about whether offensive speech is good or bad. If you poll people today, they'd probably say it's bad, right? But I think it's good. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And first of all, overriding this whole thing about speech is, what can the government do to prohibit your speech? Because people talk about the First Amendment, and one of the things about the First Amendment, let me just make sure I get this right, Congress shall make no law respecting ... or abridging the freedom of speech, right? Now, the Supreme Court has ruled on this a bunch of times, and they've said, well, they could say things like, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, because that's not so much free speech as just dangerous. Mm-hmm. You can't incite a riot, right? But the whole point is the government shouldn't be in our business with respect to free speech, and it seems like people want it in our business with respect to free speech these days. You're getting that flavor?
Yes.
In your generation, are people like, they're easily offended, but do they want the government to stop offensive speech?
Well, but to them, it's a righteous cause because they view the other viewpoint as extremely dangerous and damaging.
Right. Regardless of really whether they've thought about the other side so much, right? Well, here's a few things. So, to me, being against offensive speech is missing the forest for the trees. You know what that phrase means?
Big picture thinking.
Yeah, they're not big picture thinking because what you're doing is you're saying, I don't want people to be offended. Hey, I don't either, for the most part, right? I don't like when people are hurt and offended. But the big picture is offensive speech is critically important to evolving our ideas, right? If we're not pushed to think differently, how do we know whether our ideas are right or wrong? Tell me this, what is the echo chamber?
The echo chamber is like when you get information that already aligns with your viewpoints and it keeps, feeding in that thought.
Is it because of the algorithms of social media as well?
It's also like your identity and what you subscribe to in real life.
Right, so number one, the echo chamber would probably be hanging around with people that think like you.
Yes.
And two, getting fed stuff on social media that's similar to stuff you seem to like.
That confirms your biases. Yeah.
Now, the problem, though, is, again, it stops us from evolving our ideologies and our brains, right? There's I read a study once about cats, okay? Cats in the wild and their brains versus cats that are domesticated. Cats in the wild have much stronger and better processing brains than cats that are domestically kept. Because in the wild, I'm just looking out at our forest out here. If there's an actual cat or a cat species that's living out there, they've got to worry about hawks. They've got to worry about catching food. They've got to worry about all the hazards of the wild, which has their brain constantly processing and getting a lot sharper. If you're a cat indoors in somebody's house, they feed you. They don't attack you. You have no risk whatsoever, so their brains don't evolve as much. And in a way, offensive speech is that. Offensive speech gets us to evolve our brains because we process things differently. We're out of our comfort zone, right? And if you think about it, look at what offensive speech has yielded just in the US, okay? There's this thing that happened like 200 and something years ago called the Revolutionary War. I know that's before your time, Chris, but you've heard of it, right? Okay. The Revolutionary War was highly offensive. There were people called loyalists and patriots, right? And they were like fighting all the time, literally fighting eventually, right? And both felt that their side was correct, and they probably didn't want to hear from the other side, but it yielded a new nation, right? And then after that, there was a thing called slavery in the U.S., right? And the 13th Amendment came sometime after the Civil War, and that emancipated slaves, right? That was highly controversial and offensive. It really offended people. People were fighting about it. In fact, there was a war over it called the Civil War, where like 700,000 people died over the offensive comment, which is slaves should not be slaves, they should be free. Good thing we had offensive speech then, right?
Yes.
Then the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment ensured that all freed slaves had equal rights in every state. So certain states couldn't still essentially have slavery, right?
Right.
And then the 15th Amendment comes along, highly offensive, which essentially gave free slaves the right to vote, right? Then flash forward to like 1919 or 1920, we had the 19th Amendment, which enables women to vote. I read an article about that. Women were offended by this. Women, a huge percentage of women did not want the 19th Amendment to pass because they felt that allowing women to vote would change gender roles, and they didn't want that, right?
Yeah.
There were fights constantly about the 19th Amendment, but good thing we had the 19th Amendment and all the offensive speech that went hand in hand in that, right?
Yes.
Let's flash forward to 1964. A thing called the Civil Rights Act of 1964 gave all kinds of equality to all kinds of groups that have been oppressed and discriminated against for a long time, right? I mean, the list goes on and on and on, which is offensive speech has changed the world in positive ways. And by the way, it's a slippery slope if you try to restrict offensive speech, because how do you know which offensive speech is going to have a positive outcome and which is going to have a negative outcome, right? Yeah. And who's to say, who's to judge which speech should not be permitted because it's offensive and which offensive speech should be permitted? Are you to be that judge, Chris?
No.
Me either.
But you look at the power of words, in society. I think the clear line is what the words lead to.
Well, the thing is, offensive speech typically leads to people to think harder about issues. Yeah. Or in this day, they just shut down, yeah. Right? And they create a good and evil situation, right? Which is happening more and more. Yeah. But, so what is free or offensive speech? Obviously, everything is offensive to somebody, right? Mm-hmm. But here's the thing about offensive speech. It's got a good and a bad. The bad, I just jotted this down, so makes people upset, right? Offensive speech makes people upset. It takes them out of their comfort zone, forces them to think differently, and it's hard. Those are bad, right? But here's the good thing about offensive speech. It makes people upset. It takes people out of their comfort zone. It makes people think a different way, and that's good because it's helping our brains to evolve. So whenever I hear mostly people in your generation talk about how offended they are, I'm thinking, well, that's good. They'll probably think more about this issue, right? Yeah. So here's the other thing. All the benefits of offensive speech, we get the benefit of, right? Women can vote because of offensive speech. There's no slavery because of offensive speech. We have a nation because of offensive speech. So we like those benefits, right? Do you like those benefits?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, we all do. So it's like today they're saying, okay, we got all those benefits, but we don't want to give the same benefits to our descendants, which are more offensive speech, more changes that could be good for the people downstream from us, right? I mean,
if you look at the opposite of suppressing the voice from the other side, you create dissidents, you create people who are backed into a corner, and essentially you create an echo chamber.
Oh, by the way, no, that's an interesting point. If you don't permit free or offensive speech, people want to speak their mind about offensive stuff, right? Yeah. So when I was a kid, we used to have this thing that my mom cooked with. And by the way, it's still out there. It's called a pressure cooker, right? And I'd see my mom with that pressure cooker on the stove all the time. And it had a valve at the top to release the pressure. Because if you don't release the pressure, it explodes, right? You can actually make a pressure cooker bomb. Yeah. So now think of it in terms of people bottling up all this desire to speak offensively because they have the thoughts, right? They don't believe something. They don't believe that the common view of something is correct, and they want to change that with their speech, right? If that's bottled up inside them, we create a pressure cooker with no valve, right? And it creates violence. Yeah. better to have people let it out with their ideas than with their fists and guns and knives, right?
Absolutely.
So I have this former mentor, Don Davis, and he loves offensive speech to him because it does one of two things. He thinks about it, either he realizes they're wrong and it validates his own way of thinking, or he realizes that they're right and he evolves his own way of thinking. Both are good, right? So stopping the offensive speech stops human evolution, in my view. I'll give you a great example. My buddy Mike Sabatka and I had a discussion about abortion, highly controversial, right? And I'm not going to say who was on which side, right? But we made an agreement. We were going to keep walking in one direction until we came up with a rule that we could both agree with. He was offended by my comments. I was a little offended by his comments, but we couldn't turn around until we agreed upon it. So we did that very thing. We came up with a common ground with respect to this highly controversial issue, and we both legitimately agreed to the rule. I'm not saying we just did it because we wanted to turn around and come home, but we legitimately agreed to it because I got to see what his position was. Why was he so angry about this issue? And he got to see what my position was. We hadn't done that before because we were also in the echo chamber, only listening to people that agreed with us, right? But it yielded a rule. Now, the rule didn't go anywhere because it's just Tom and Mike. Yeah. It's not, president and Senate. But if people bigger than us did that, it could have gone someplace, right?
The how it would look now would probably be like, okay, agree to disagree. Bye.
Yes, but if you agree to disagree, that doesn't give you a solution, right? I mean, agreeing to disagree is probably better than what people are doing today, which is, I'm not even agreeing to that.
Yeah.
I won't agree to disagree. But at least if you say, yeah, you have a valid point, I have a valid point, we'll agree to disagree. That's better than what we've got. But it's even better if we think hard enough about the other person's position, maybe respect that they're smart and they have their own ideas, and come up with a rule, right? Yeah. Come up with a rule on whatever that is.
Yeah, I wish that happened.
Yeah. Hey, so another thing. This guy, Ricky Gervais, he's a comedian. Have you ever heard of him?
I've heard of him.
Okay. I don't know much about him, but I heard him say one thing which I liked, which is, just because you're offended, it doesn't mean you're right, right? Just because you're hurt, it doesn't mean you're a victim. It doesn't mean that your position is correct and the person who gave you offensive speech is wrong. And that's true. It doesn't really, the fact that you're harmed by offensive speech doesn't conclude anything about who's right or wrong with the offensive speech.
Right.
And again, everything seems to offend somebody, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I've read a whole bunch of books on the Soviet Union over the past 12 months, right? I did Catherine the Great. Well, that was before the Soviet Union. Then I did Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, the Gulag Archipelago, Putin, and Gorbachev, right? And one thing I discovered is the Soviet Union did not like offensive speech. I mean, they did not like offensive speech. In fact, if you offended them, the government, you'd go in a gulag. And these gulags were horrible prisons where most of the people ended up dead. Mm-hmm. Those who did not end up dead ended up seriously damaged, either physically or emotionally. But it was all because they were saying things that were offensive. And then look what ultimately happened to the Soviet Union. They collapsed in the late 1980s because, in my view, one of the reasons is they didn't have free speech. They didn't have the opportunity to voice their views that were contrary to the way things were going, which kept the nation from evolving in the way it needed to evolve to compete on the world stage, right? And they ultimately collapsed. But before they collapsed, I think like 60 million people were killed in Soviet gulags. Wow. A lot of them just because they opposed the mentality of the government and exercised some little tiny layer of free speech.
That's crazy.
So anyway, let's just shift quickly, because I want to make sure we're good on time, to hate speech, right? There's offensive speech, and then there's really offensive speech, which is hate speech, right? How do you feel about hate speech? Are you for it or against it?
I think it's hard to define what is hate speech, because who's in charge of that?
Well, that's one of the problems with trying to ban hate speech, is who decides what's hate speech. I have a friend who loves hate speech because he wants to see people who hate him coming. He says, so this is a Jewish guy. And he says, I would like people to wear on their t-shirts that they hate Jews, so that when they're walking up to me, I know that they hate me. It's kind of like me. If you hate short, bald guys, and a lot of people do, I get that. But I want to know who hates short, bald guys when they come up to me, right? So until we can eliminate hate speech is a valuable tool to identify those who hate us, right? And we can't eliminate hate because humans hate, right? They get angry. Some humans hate more than other humans, but it seems like everybody's got a little tiny bit of hate in them, right?
Yeah, people have been killing each other since the beginning.
Yeah, right. So there's a lot of hate going around. So should we ban hate speech? And it seems to me that there is an advantage of hate speech, which is, well, number one, it's a slippery slope. How do you know where to draw the line? Who defines what's hate speech and what is not? If I say, Chris, I hate you, is that hate speech? Well, I use the word hate, but is it hate speech? But what if I say, I hate you because you're from Thailand? Now is it hate speech because I'm hating a whole group of people?
Yeah.
Probably hate speech.
Yeah.
But then the question is, do you want to know that I hate, and by the way, I don't hate anybody from Thailand, just so we're clear. But do you want to know that I hate everybody from Thailand before I show up?
That would be helpful.
Yeah, it'd be helpful, right? And you might even want to say to me, why do you hate people from this particular, like, let's use short, bald guys, because that's easy for me to use, because I'm a short, bald guy.
Right.
If you hate short, bald guys, I'd like to know why.
I hate short, bald guys.
I know why. That's the thing, is why. I mean, number one, I want to know that you hate us, you hate my kind, before you attack me. And number two, I'd like to know why, because who knows? Let's use Don Davis's example. When somebody says something that offends you, it gives you the opportunity to analyze it, and it either validates your view or evolves your view. Maybe there's a good reason you hate short, bald guys. I mean, we're short, so by definition, we're angry, right? Yeah. We're bald, which means everybody hates us, so we're angry about that too. So maybe we've become angry as a species, right?
Yeah, I mistrust the lack of hair.
Exactly. But I would like to know that, because then I could analyze it, and either I'm right that short, bald guys are good, or you're right that short, bald guys are terrible, and I can evolve my way of thinking, right?
I see your point.
Okay. So anyway, I do have one other, somebody else came up with something on hate speech. We were talking about it, and she goes, why would I care what that idiot has to say? That was her point of view, is if somebody's a hater, why would I care what they hate? Because obviously they're being overly emotional. They're not being rational if they hate. By definition, if you're hating, you're being overly emotional, right? Mm-hmm. And that's kind of like another way to look at it, which is, why do you care? I mean, as long as you know they're coming, so you can protect yourself. I think the worst part is what happens from hate, which is violence. Yeah. But maybe if you give haters a chance to do their verbal hating, and then they can also let you know they're coming, maybe that reduces violence. Because we're never going to eliminate hate.
Well, that's transparency, I think.
It gives more. I love it.
It's a critical element of how, like you said, the pressure cooker happens, you know?
Yes. But no, it's also a critical element to safety. Transparency, right? We want to see them coming, right? So anyway, so are you in favor of offensive speech or opposed to offensive speech in light of this conversation?
I oppose hate speech, but I can see, you know, it's like a nuanced take on it. Clearly, there are definitions of hate speech.
Start with offensive speech. Should offensive speech be banned?
Offensive speech should be a thing because, as you clearly point out, there's a progression that comes from it.
Okay, so we shouldn't ban offensive speech.
We should have open discourse.
Okay, should we ban hate speech?
I think we should have clear guidelines on defining hate and transparency behind it.
Okay, so should the government should they criminalize hate speach?
I don't trust the government. So
you hate the government. No, I'm kidding. You don't trust. Yeah, so the question is, who does that, right? Who defines which speech should be, and by the way, why do you think hate speech should be criminalized? Not by the government, but by somebody.
Because if it's a valid point, people will agree upon it. If open discourse is allowed.
Right, but on hate speech.
On hate speech, yeah.
What if open discourse is allowed and everybody agrees with it?
Well, there's open discussion and it has been fully fleshed out in an idealistic world where people aren't biased and people can have logical conversations and reach a truth. then people will make up their minds, and the government won't have to step in.
Yeah. So really, what you're saying is hate speech should just work itself out with no government intervention.
Ideally, yeah.
Okay. All right. That's all the time we have, Chris.
Thank you, sir.
All right. That was